Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So today I'm going to be sitting down with Martin Armstrong, and I'm extremely excited about this conversation. So if you haven't heard of Martin Armstrong, I suggest you look him up because he is actually one of the most influential people in the world when it comes to global finance and economy. He is someone that literally the central banks would bring in Martin Armstrong to consult on what's happening with currency exchanges and the overall bigger picture financial situation. He was also someone, as he'll probably tell us in the interview today, that would be vetting presidential candidates. So he vetted everybody from Trump to Bush Jr. to lots of these different candidates. They brought him in because this guy really knows what he's talking about. And even more so, he wrote an algorithm that could literally predict the rise and fall of currencies, countries, even predict when wars would happen. And the government wanted this algorithm so much, and he refused to give it to them out of principle, they even imprisoned him for over a decade because he would not hand over this algorithm. So there's a lot that we're going to be talking about today. I've got a whole list of questions from China and Russia and Ukraine to the dollar to the Western central banks. There's just so much to talk about, and I hope that you really enjoy this interview ahead. But before we get started, folks, make sure you're following me on Telegram and Truth Social at Man in America. You can also catch every episode as a podcast if you just want to listen. So the links to my podcast and social media are all in the description below, or just search for Man in America in your favorite podcast app and make sure you leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps me to reach more people. Also, folks, much of the world is going through a process that experts are calling de-dollarization. And I'm sure that Martin and I are going to talk about this because I know that he's talked a lot about the coming collapse of the dollar and the collapse of the Western banking system in general. But what this means, though, de-dollarization, is that basically the US dollar is a fiat currency, meaning it isn't backed by anything of real value. The only thing that gives our dollar any value is its demand around the world, especially because it's been tied to petroleum. But now, and especially under the incompetent Biden regime, the world is losing faith in the dollar. It's very, very close to losing its status as the petrodollar and the world reserve currency, especially now that oil-producing nations are abandoning the U.S. for China and other BRICS nations. But what happens if the dollar loses that sacred status? Well, the value of our dollars, our life savings, IRAs, stocks, bank accounts could literally be wiped out in a matter of months, weeks, or even overnight. And look, I'm not a financial advisor, so please do your own research. But I believe that now more than ever, it's a good time to consider transferring at least some of your wealth into physical gold and silver. Folks, these are real world assets that have stood the test of time. They've stuck around with the rise and fall of civilizations, the collapse of currencies. They've always maintained their value. But look, I want to be really, really clear. You don't buy gold and silver to get rich. You do it to protect and preserve your wealth. There's a reason why nations like Russia are backing their currency with gold and why the elites are buying up physical gold and silver like we've never seen before. But they don't want you to know that. They want you to lose everything if the dollar collapses. And so now, folks, is the time to protect your financial future. And for this, I'm confident recommending Kirk Elliott, PhD. You can buy gold and silver directly, even in small amounts, shipped to your front door, or you can transfer your IRA into physical gold and silver with zero taxes or penalties. If you want to learn more about this, open up a new tab right now and go to goldwithseth.com, or you can call 720-605-3900 to speak to someone right now. Kirk Elliott's team of advisors will answer all of your questions and take care of you every step of the way. And look, Kirk is who I use. He's who my family use, my friends use. He's someone I genuinely recommend. This guy is an amazing Christian patriot, and he really wants to help protect us financially. So again, folks, that's 720-605-3900 or goldwithseth.com. All right, folks, let's go ahead and jump into this interview because I'm very excited to get started. Mr. Martin Armstrong, it is such an honor to have you here. You're somebody who has done incredible work and you've been persecuted for it, which maybe we can talk about at some point. But just what's happening in the world is really incredibly crazy, as we all know, and I'm excited to get your opinion on things. So just thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I think the more people that understand what's going on, the better, really.
So I've got a huge list of questions and topics, and so I mean we can kind of go wherever you want to go with it. But I would say The big thing I'm looking at is as I see what's happening as a result of the war in Ukraine, the fertilizer shortages, the food shortages, as I see what's happening with the BRICS nations and their, kind of emerging new currencies and how they're pulling a lot of the energy resources and financial, capabilities from the West over. I'm looking at what's happening in China. I'm looking at what's happening, in America with the recent midterm elections. And what I'm seeing is just everything seems to be destabilizing and going through a very big change. And so I know you've talked about, what you see, happening by 2032, which seems to be a key point. But I'd like just to see, like, wherever you want to dive in on these topics of what you see happening over the next decade or so.
Well, first I should say that I had, being an international hedge fund manager, I began to see how capital really moved. And not just did the capital move, but then also the talent would move. For example, in the mid 80s, we were all in Geneva dealing with the OPEC money. And then Japan started rising. And then all the top brokers that were there in Geneva moved and migrated to Tokyo. And then that became the big boom into 1989. And then, so the computer that I developed was from that international perspective. And I realized that, just as you've said, we're not an island. We have politicians that say, vote for me and I'll bring unemployment down or whatever. It's all nonsense. Mainly because we're all in this globally together. And the United States was 70% agrarian in 1850. And J.P. Morgan had to bail out the U.S. Treasury in 1896, lending 100 million in gold. We were basically bankrupt. And the United States rose simply because of World War I in Europe. So then all the capital moved here. And New York emerged as the first financial capital of the world after, Britain lost it because of World War I. Then World War II comes. And then the US ended up with 76% of the official world gold reserves. So that's why Bretton Woods took place and why the dollar became the reserve currency of the world. So those events had nothing to do with domestic politics. They were external.
Yeah.
And so we have to understand that we are all connected. And this war in Ukraine is affecting everything globally. So you can't just simply wage war like this. And our politicians are honestly, I don't know, I'd have to say brain dead, but
That's being kind.
yeah, I mean, they just don't. And I'm not just talking about Biden, I'm talking about in Europe. I mean, Trudeau in Canada. It seems like we have the worst possible crop of world leaders in human history. There's nobody there with any, even questions anything at this stage. The COVID lockdowns, I mean, how hard was it to understand that if you locked down the whole country, that even food would not be produced and the supply chain? I mean, I had bought a new refrigerator and it was delayed 6 months. And I said, what's the problem? They said, oh, well, the chips come from Thailand, So, the fact that they just locked everybody down like this showed that there was no understanding other than what's immediately in front of their nose. They don't look at any action they take and say, gee, if we do this, are there other implications? Never. Any public, decision made is just for what's immediately there. I mean, I've worked with governments really for more than 40 years. And we were forecasting all the currencies from the 70s. And I didn't realize that how we became the biggest in the world was simply, again, politics. Um, when we were going to open up an office in Geneva back in the early 80s, I met with one of our clients there, and uh, we had all the biggest institutions because our really our reports were going out by telex. So that was overseas. It was $75 per telex. I mean, we had people paying $200,000-300,000 just in communication costs. So that's why we ended up with the biggest institutions. Honestly, nobody else could afford it. Um, then fax came, and that lowered the cost. Now we're emails, and it's free, basically. But back then, I went to lunch, and we were going to open up an office in Geneva, and I knew that there was always this anti-Americanism there and throughout Europe. And so I came up with a list of names like European advisors or whatever. I went to lunch, and I was asking him, what would you recommend? And he said to me, he says, name one European analyst. And I was embarrassed. I'm thinking, oh, here I am, the American arrogant, person, because I couldn't name any. And I said, I'm sure there are. I just don't know any. And he laughed, and he says, there are none. And he says that if he's British, it's always God save the Queen. If he's French, it's this. And what he explained was after World War II, the currencies there were basically zero. So you're starting from scratch. So if the Deutschmark was up 10% against the dollar, the politician said, see, I did a good job. This is proving what I'm doing is correct. So consequently, there was no analyst in Europe. If you came out and said the Deutschmark would go down, that you were being a traitor. It became political. Whereas here in the United States, nobody would ever stand up and say, vote for me because the dollar's up against the Mexican peso or something. Yeah. I mean, that would have been a joke. So he explained to me, he says, the reason everybody uses you because you don't care if the dollar goes up or down. I said, it's just a trade, so we ended up around the entire world. And when they were forming the G5 in 1985, I was called in. And at first I thought, gee, I guess I really made it, one of the top people in the world on foreign exchange. Then you get there and they say, gee, how do we save the world? Oh, sorry, your 15 minutes is up next. And then they stand up with their conclusion. And then that taught me what government really was about. These people have a proposal, and they've already concluded what they're going to do. They drag in some so-called experts, pretend that they listen to them, and then they stand up and make their conclusions anyhow. They had nothing to do with what anybody testified about. So I had gone out of committee back then, and I wrote to Reagan, and I said, this is crazy. I mean, they were talking about forming the G5, lowering the value of the dollar by 40%. And I said, you people are going to cause a major crash in 2 years, which was the 87 crash. And that's what I mean. They don't look at anything. I said, you've just sold a third of the national debt to Japan. And you're now saying the dollar is going to go down by 40%. Don't you think they would sell? Oh, gee, why? I mean, they have no practical understanding of anything. So we came, when the 87 crash came, then they were, the Brady Commission wanted to get me in and stuff. And I said, no, sorry, I'm not interested in your dog and pony shows. So they started lobbying friends of mine. And actually, it was Jack Schwager who said, Marty, if you don't do this, they're going to come take all our computers away. So because then the theory was it was all about computer trading caused it, and if you read the Brady Commission report at the very end, I at least managed to get them to prevent any major attack on the private sector. And at the end of the report, they says, "Well, we think currency had something to do with it." That was the best I could get out of it, because you're asking them to say, "Gee, we formed the G5 and it was the government's fault." They're not going to say it. So at least saying, "Well, we think currency had something to do with it," was like a major accomplishment, really. And so over the years, um, because we had focused on currency and it was really highly political outside the United States, that's why everybody ended up using us. I mean, even in the '07 to '08 crisis, one economist in Estonia came out and said, "Gee, we're going to have a major recession," and they put him in jail. you know, Locked him up for 6 months. How dare you say that? So it's always been this um, political interference to some degree, and I guess that's been behind my reputation that I've refused to deal with that nonsense. And um, I was, quite surprised. I was giving a lecture. I think it was at Market Technicians in Chicago, and Milton Friedman came to listen to me. And after I was done, he came up and shook my hand, and he said this was really the best speech he's ever heard. And then I was like really kind of surprised, but he had written a piece in 1953 about the floating exchange rate and how capital would move. And I'm giving a speech basically on this topic. And he wanted to come listen. And he says, "You're basically doing what I had only dreamed of." And of course, Milton was, instrumental in the 1971 collapse of Bretton Woods and advised Nixon on the floating exchange rate. But he had envisioned that back in 1953. And he's correct. So, I mean, all these attempts by governments to fix um, exchange rates, pegging them, or like the gold standard in the sense of it's always going to be $35, but you continue to create more dollars. I honestly, if a third grader should figure it out with a pocket calculator, this is going to go bust.
Yeah.
Um, but this is what we're at now, and after 40 years of being called into all sorts of different crises around the world, what I've found is that government is hopeless. Um, I've gone in there and said, "Listen, if we don't do this system that you people are doing for borrowing year after year with no intention of ever paying anything back," I said, "it's going to go bust." I said, "I give you maybe 20 years we got." And the response would be, "Yeah, okay, fine, but I might not be here in 20 years."
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can't get a politician to do anything for the long term. And I guess the way, um, from their perspective, and this is what's wrong with a republic, um, they will just stand up and make whatever promise they need to make. And they're not looking at the long term at all. So it's like, I can say, "Vote for me, I'm going to run for president. I saved your job." And you're going to look at me and say, "How did I know I would have lost it?" It's better you lose your job. And then I say, "Vote for me. I'll get the guy that did it." This is the way politics really works. So there is no buddy coming on a white horse to save our,
Yeah.
our butts here. I mean, this is it.
Like the problem is so much bigger. It's like even when Trump came in 2016, they say he's going to drain the swamp. Like, well, what's that mean? Because the swamp is it's almost like the whole world is run by the swamp, and you can expect one man to bring down this gigantic corrupt, cabal of criminals. It's like, well, No, maybe, even if he fixes DC, it's like what's happening is so much bigger than that.
Well, yeah, Trump, I think, was good-hearted. He understood the problems. We have we have a swamp and term limits, and I think probably the vast majority agreed with that, which is what really got him elected. Where he was naive was that the swamp is both sides, and so you had a lot of the elite Republicans immediately against him as well. And I can tell you, I was also used to be part of the vetting process for president. And they would send me in to meet various people who wanted to run for president. And they said I was there to advise them on how the world economy works. But in truth, it was really me looking at them and saying, do you think he understood? Was there a light on? That kind of stuff. And then uh, George Bush Jr. comes up, and then they say, look, we want you to go down there and meet him. I said, yeah, okay, fine. And they said, no, this one's different. I said, what's different? And I swear to God, they said to me, he's really stupid. I said, what? Um, which was 180 degrees from everything we were doing up to then. And I said, why would you make somebody stupid president? And they said, look, he's got the name. And then I was asked if I would accept the position in the White House as chief economic advisor. And I said, no, I'm not interested in that. Thank you very much. But, I'm not giving up my company for 2 years of this. And I knew Washington. I said, forget it. They're going to say I advised Toyota and Mercedes against General Motors. So I'm a traitor or something like that. I said, I'm not going to go through that shit. I mean, forget it. But they picked all the people in the cabinet. It's not Bush. They picked Cheney. They did the same thing to Trump. And I can tell you that I've been contacted again, trying to get me back into politics. And they wanted me to go talk to Trump, talk him out of running in 2024, and to go meet DeSantis, which I did. But they wanted me to advise him. They said he's a better administrator. And I told him, I said, look, you get me involved, I'm going to tell DeSantis not to leave Florida. Thank you very much. And I said, because you people are just going to eat him for lunch. And, that's what will happen. I was there when Ronald Reagan was elected. And what took place in Washington kind of really, that opened my eyes a lot, in the sense that they were looking at him as a problem. He was a governor. They only want people that are senators or congressmen. You're going to come from the swamp, is the way they look at it. So you just look at, for Trump, they picked Pence. For Biden, okay, he's a member of the swamp anyhow. And then they pick, Camilla, a senator. They don't want somebody that is a governor, a local person, because they don't know the way it works. That's basically it. And why I say Republics are the worst is I could run for office and say, vote for me, I'll save the whales, I'll do whatever, oh, yeah, okay, fine. Then you get to Washington, there's an introductory meeting. And then you're told, we don't care about that. You will vote according to what we tell you. And so if you look closely, you'll see all these votes are down party line. So it doesn't matter what you say if you want to run for office. They want to hear women's rights, this, that. It's okay. Promise whatever you want. Biden basically was promising, he'll make abortion a constitutional amendment. He can't. Okay. At first, it's got to get through the Congress and the Senate. Then the majority of the states have to vote on it. I mean, to make a constitutional amendment is monumental work, and it's years. Um, and I was working on Capitol Hill when we were dealing with, the tax reforms in the 90s. And I ended up between Bill Archer, who was a Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. He supported retail sales tax from Texas. And the head of the Republicans was Dick Armey, also from Texas. All right. Dick was for the flat tax, and Bill was for the retail sales tax. And I'm the one going back and forth between the two. And I said, look, why don't we just sit down for dinner? We can, have a conversation together. Can't do that. Why? Well, then people will think we're compromising. So, I mean, it's that petty.
Yeah.
And I honestly, why I kind of quit was I was in Dick Armey's office and he said, Marty, look, you know cycles. I can't agree to Bill and retail sales tax because when the Democrats get back in, as you know they will, we'll have both. And I looked at him and he says, without, repealing the income tax, I can't go. And I looked at him and I said, Dick, you're absolutely right. And I just kind of gave up at that point. It's so Biden saying, oh, he'll make it a constitutional amendment for abortion. I mean, that is an outright lie. He knew it. It can't be done. And the same thing with repealing the income tax. I realize you're right. We're not going to get it done. And so Dick would not support the retail sales tax, and very practical. And that's what Washington's about. It's they had asked me to revise the Social Security system. I set it up. I said, this is how it works. Okay, people would submit their track records, and we select the people that have had the best, long-term track record in managing money. The idea was to turn it into a wealth fund, and Democrats wouldn't agree. They said, well, we want to be able to change the fund managers when we get in. I said, look, I don't care who he voted for. All right. I'm not going to ask that question. We can't make decisions on handing out money because it's a friend of yours. But that's why Social Security is where it is, and it's going to go bust. And I tried working on that and had set up the entire proposal. And it's all about what do I get out of it?
Yeah. So
That's it.
basically what you're seeing is just that there's these bigger cycles and movements, and the politicians just become this bread and circus show. Like they really don't actually change anything. They're all just focused on the immediate. And yet you have there's a freight train coming down, and they're arguing over what color the logs are going to be next to the train to build the station, and while the people are laying on the tracks. So, in terms of, kind of where we are now, what do you see? Because everything, as I mentioned in the beginning, indicates that there's a major shakeup that's, in the midst. And I know you've talked about whether or not we have a 2024 election is even a toss up. I mean, so like what I'm kind of putting together is just that the system has become so broken at every level that it's almost beyond repair, and that the only thing that can happen is that the whole thing has to kind of collapse, and with big shifts happening in the world. So, what do you see happening over the next couple of years, especially as it relates to the what the BRICS nations are doing and how that's going to interact with what the Western world is doing?
Well, I think that once again, when they lowered interest rates to negative in 2014, I warned them, this is not going to work. You're really going to destroy the bond markets, etc. They don't even understand. I can tell you that Mario Draghi sat in a bond room just to try and observe how it worked. And then you put somebody like this in charge of the central bank. You might as well, take a cab driver. Oh, you look nice. Okay, I'll put you in charge of it. These people have zero experience. So the problem we have by lowering interest rates to negative in 2014. Now they just, went back to positive this year. And you have wiped out the entire bond market of Europe. And this is what London crisis was about. And the press doesn't explain it. But all of a sudden, interest rates go up to 3%. That bond you have, which is negative, you've lost 40% if you had to sell it today. All right. You're not going to earn anything on it. And you have to compensate for what would a normal bond be in order for some to sell it. So what happened in London was that all the life companies and pension funds, they've had it. They can't buy any more long-term debt. And particularly in a situation where you have central banks saying we have to fight inflation, we're going to be raising rates, that means every time they raise the rate, whatever bond you bought last week is now worth less. So effectively, they ran away from the long term. And Janet Yellen stood up and said, well, maybe the Treasury should be buying in the long term and swapping it with the short. Now, again, a lot of people don't understand the real structures of these things. So one guy claiming, oh, the Treasury wants to compete with the Fed and become a central bank. That's not true. The Fed can create money, the Treasury can't. The Treasury just issues the bonds. What she's talking about is that the appetite for long-term debt is collapsing. All right. So saying that she would buy in the long-term and swap it with short-term is the problem we're facing. The monetary system is collapsing. All right. The central banks are locked into Keynesian economics. Now, when Keynes came up with this theory in the Great Depression, the US had a balanced budget. All right. So we were the lion's share of the market, borrowing and speculating, et cetera. So at least you could say it made sense, raising interest rates to reduce our demand. However, today government is the elephant in the room. You raise the interest rates, it doesn't stop them from spending more. In fact, they only increase their expenditure because they have to pay the interest. So Keynesian economics completely collapses, and that's the problem. So
that's where we're at right now, right? Is it's starting to spiral out of control.
This type of inflation was caused by COVID. Despite Biden wants to blame Putin, that's very nice, but he wants to blame Putin for everything. You locked everybody down. That set in motion shortages. I got emails from farmers that had to kill 30,000 chickens because they couldn't get on the market. So you now have, an inflation that is not speculative like in the 20s. This is one based upon shortages. So
I see.
They're raising interest rates is not going to do anything other than make it worse. But under Keynesian economics, that's the only tool the central bank has. So if they don't raise interest rates, then the politician blames them, even though it won't work. So we're in this absolute economic nightmare where inflation is going nowhere but up into 2024 because we're dealing with shortages. Then you have this climate change agenda of shutting down energy in the United States, et cetera. And then you tack on the sanctions they put on Russia and blew up the pipeline. It's they didn't even quite, I don't think, understood that Russia was the biggest exporter of fertilizer. It's like I say, they only look at what's immediately in front of their nose. And there's nobody that sits down and says, gee, if we do this, what would else happen? They just don't do that. So um, then the sanctions that they put on Russia are really a violation of international law. It's one thing for one country to put sanctions on another, like US versus Iran. All right. When you started going after individuals, saying, oh, well, he's an oligarch, and that basically violated international law. Now, what's the implications of that? If you're in China and you're a big investor in the United States, and the United States gets in a tiff over Taiwan with China, are they going to come for your assets?
Exactly.
So these are things they don't appreciate. You can't just rob the oligarchs of Russia without everybody else outside the country saying, wait a minute, maybe they could do that to me. So, I mean, you violated international law there. You should have just kept it between Russia and the United States or Europe or whatever. But I mean, this nonsense has been very serious. And again, I don't think that these politicians understand what they have done. But then you have Klaus Schwab, who you have to understand when he's out there really saying you'll own nothing and be happy. What he's really doing is trying to make it sound like, look, we're headed to this major collapse in world debt and sovereign debt. It's all going to default. All right. But we're going to do this for you. All right. It's kind of like insurance. You buy basically every fire insurance, accident insurance. They couldn't sell death insurance. So they just changed the name to life insurance. And then everybody wanted it. Death insurance, people would say, no, I'm not ready to die yet. Maybe it'd be bad luck if I bought it. So call it life insurance, and then they brag about how much they have. That's what Schwab is doing. Okay. This saying, oh, you'll own nothing and be happy, is making it sound, I'm going to relieve you of all your debt problems. Don't worry about it, etc. When it's the government that, if the government defaults, they've already wiped out all the pension funds in Europe. That's what the guaranteed basic income is about. Okay. The replacement for, because they've wiped out your pension funds. So with their negative interest rates over there. So what you have is this, guaranteed basic income to replace your pension. So I think they realize if they just defaulted, they're going to have millions of people with pitchforks, storming the parliaments down there. So we're dealing with a collapse in the monetary system. The very ideas of everything we had, they're falling apart. And as I've said, I've tried for decades. Look, this is going to happen. And I mean, I'm not brilliant. I think honestly, I think a third year grader with a pocket calculator could have come up with the same conclusion. It's just that these people will not react or take measure for long term. It's like, I just have to be elected next year. I don't care what happens after that. And we're paying the price for that. And people don't realize, I mean, there was fake news throughout history. Cicero was probably the greatest fake news guy ever, and he unfortunately influenced our founding fathers. They thought a republic was really good, and that's not true. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the calendar was all screwed up. Why? Because the high priest could insert the labor, the extra days for leap year, etc. The basic calendar was the moon calendar, but they knew it wasn't correct. So the politicians would just bribe them. Well, we don't want to go to election. Give us an extra 2 months. And the calendar got so screwed up. So when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, what should have been winter was really summer. All right. And that's why we have he came in, he set himself up as the high priest, and established the Julian calendar, all right, which we use today to eliminate that corruption. You can't bribe the high priest anymore. that comes to an end. But everything was like that. There wasn't anything that was hadn't been completely corrupted. And just look at it when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, all the cities opened up and cheered. All right. It was the Senate that fled. All right. They all, if they were so great, why did they flee? Why did the people, cheer Caesar and not them? And they all hopped on their boats and fled to Asia. So, that was the real story of a republic. It becomes so corrupt because they can basically be bribed. I go to them and say, look, I need this, I need that, whatever. I mean, just if our congressman had to be like a NASCAR driver with a jacket with all the logos and
Sponsors,
who's
yeah.
support. I mean, there wouldn't be enough room.
Exactly.
um, I mean, but that's the way it really is.
Yeah.
It's pathetic, but uh, I ended up in the position I was because I went out of committee. When I did back in '85, they said to me, "You'll never be called again." And I said, "Who cares? All right, this is a dog and pony show. I'm not interested in this anyhow. I thought you people were calling me because you really wanted serious advice, you know." But that's what I was told. And they said, "Oh, you can be if you're a good boy, we give you all these studies to do for us, and you can earn like $5 million a year." I said, "Thanks a lot. I can do that on my own." Um, but that's why. So you get all these advisors that are on the payroll of the government. That, just as I explained about in Europe, they're never going to go out of committee because they're living off of that money coming from Congress. Every bill that they present, Obamacare, whatever, it goes out to somebody. They create a study. Oh, this is going to save $10 trillion or whatever. They they tell you what it's supposed to say, and you back into it. That's the way it really works.
Yeah.
So when I went out of committee, um, it ended up with me being the one that they always want to come to because they know I'm going to tell them the truth.
You're be honest. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
so I mean, even when China, you know, uh, went to capitalism, uh, I was called up and went over there, and it was very interesting experience. I was taken off to this facility, and they had hundreds of people in there downloading everything from the internet, and they were tracking absolutely everything, but they were not interfering like the Russians were. And what I mean by that, if you wanted to open up a restaurant in Moscow, and your head would be in the gutter over there because you're competing against another oligarch. That's just the way. Like 70,000 people were assassinated in a single year. Whereas China didn't do that. Um, the government was monitoring absolutely everything, but they were not interfering. They were trying to study how it worked. And I was taken in, and there was 249 varieties of tea. I never knew there were that many in China. Um, and the questions I was getting, like, how could this tea, say, selling for $1, be $5 someplace else? And I said, well, where's it coming from? Over here. I said, well, naturally, it's going to be the cheapest wherever you're doing it. First, you have community, transportation costs. And it was like, oh, yeah, okay. And then I had to explain that, look, somebody will pay more for something if they like this one better than that. So coming out of communism, I could see why it really collapsed, because that tea for $1 in one place would be $5, would still be $1 someplace else, even if it costs $10 to get it there. That's why communism doesn't work. And this whole thing about equality, etc., it's nonsense.
Oh,
I
it
also
is.
went behind the Berlin Wall, and I saw the same thing. And and that has upset me to some degree about this cancel culture. Everybody has to be conforming, and uh, the day the Berlin Wall went up, I was with a friend. Um, a friend of mine was a little kid back then, walking on the right side of the street with his grandmother. So he became American, but the rest of his family was trapped. So I went there with him. He wanted me to go because he heard he might be kidnapped if they found out he was really born there or whatever. Um, and we met his cousin, and she took us around town. And anybody remotely close to us, she was, oh, this is the people viewer. They take such wonderful care of us. And as soon as nobody was around, she called them every name in the book, you know. Um, so you could see what this cancel culture is the same thing. Everybody has to be complying with what we say is supposed to be there. And that's very dangerous
Yeah.
because what is the fundamental foundation of civilization, how we advance, is ingenuity. And if you're not free to think and to explore and imagine what would it be like to go to the stars? And nobody's ever going to create a rocket to go there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Now, I have a question about so with communism in China specifically, I mean, you can see that it seems like it may be on its last leg right now with the protests heightening, everything's really intensifying over there. Now, I know that some of your models have pointed towards China becoming everything shifting back to China as the really the economic center of the world, over the next decade. But it'd be hard to imagine that happening under the current communist system, which is, I think, very, very, very broken, to put it lightly. So, do you see I mean, do you really think that things will shift back over to China as the center? And will there be a big change? What is it gonna be the same Communist Party now that's ruling at that point because their objectives with the BRICS and everything has really come to fruition? Or do you think there's gonna be a massive shift and a change and something new is gonna be emerging
now, chances are that every form of government around the world will change.
in the next 10 years, you mean?
Yeah, but it's um, you're seeing the stress there in China. But what you have to understand is that they are in the stage of growing to freedom, whereas we're in the stage of losing our freedom.
Yeah.
All right. And um, so they're more like the United States was in the 1700s. And the people are, uh, they believe in cycles. And when Jinping basically says it's our time, he knows what he's talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
The West does not. The West, I mean, there is an interesting book called The Geography of Thought. And in the first page, the Nesbitt who wrote it, he said he had a Chinese student, and he said who explained to him, we think in basically in cycles, you think in a straight line, and it's so true. All our analysis, I mean, uh, COVID, why was it wrong? Oh, they took some study and okay, fine. It's the same thing as climate change. Oh, gee, it went up 2 degrees this year. So therefore, they project that out for 100 years. Oh, we're all going to die. There's a cycle to things. It's up and down. Okay. That's like saying the Dow Jones went up 1,000 points. All right, this month. So it's going up 1,000 points every month for here on out. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Climate change, same thing. Climate has always changed. Uh, you know, ice ages, people forget about that sort of stuff. How did we get back to warming if there were no SUVs driving, kids to school? I mean, all these things have have a cycle to them. Asia knows that, and I would say, um, being around the world, I would have to explain cycles in Europe and America. When I went to Asia, I never had to because it was part of their religion. They understood it. So the the type of government, what is going on in China is that uh, you know they have they still have retained the name Communist Party. I mean, they're not communists any way, shape, or form. I mean, communism means the government owns everything. Um, so, although they have moved towards capitalism, they've retained that name. Why? It's maybe a sense of old power, something like that. Um, Refusal to admit that maybe communism failed. Whatever the psychological reasoning to retaining that name is kind of hard to, you know, nail down specifically. But we have the same problem over in Russia too. You have all this propaganda that they put out against Putin, and I mean, I just put a book out called the seizure, the plot to seize Russia, and
Right here,
um,
it's a textbook. It's like,
well, I got a hold of all the declassified documents from the Clinton administration, and it shows exactly the same problem. When um, communism fell there, all right, there was a coup against Gorbachev in '91. Why? Because I began right there in the front of that book and said, here's the declassified document. NATO invited Russia to join, which is omitted from every history book I've ever seen. Um, and I put it in there. Here it is, black and white, declassified documents. And then it makes sense. Then you understand why the old communists staged this coup against Gorbachev. From their perspective, that's Russia surrendering to the United States. All right, so they saw it as the collapse of their government. Um, on the other side, you had the oligarchs led by Baryshnovsky, who blackmailed Yeltsin and wanted to become the head of Russia and bring it into NATO. And so Yeltsin was besieged on two fronts. He had the oligarchs trying to steal the country, and then he had the old line communists who filed a motion for impeachment to try and get rid of him so that they could reestablish the USSR. And that's why he turned to Putin. Putin was not a communist and he wasn't an oligarch. And all this nonsense, always ex-KGB. Yeah, he was a low-level ex-KGB guy who quit immediately in 1991. He was never the head of the KGB or something like that. And all the documents, I've got the phone calls in there from Yeltsin to Clinton saying, I selected him. It was hard to find somebody who would continue the democratic process and who was not a communist and not an oligarch, basically. So Putin was the one in the middle. And that's why, from the Russian perspective, he was probably more like a Trump, and that his popularity was like 75%, because they did not want to go back to communism any more than China would want to go back. Once the people have freedom, they don't want to hand it back. All right. So with the Russia stuff, the propaganda has been, it makes no sense, but like they create this image like somehow if you got rid of Putin, then everything would be okay. All the guys that are threatening nukes and stuff, they're the right side. You remove Putin and they're going to get control. That's what's going to happen. Even the head of Chetnik came out and said, they should just nuke Kiev. And Putin came out and said, no, we don't want to go in that direction. So it was Putin who's been against that, not the opposite. So I'm much more concerned that you do this. And I think this whole agenda on both sides is in part that they need war because the monetary system is collapsing.
I see. It makes sense.
They're looking at this as if we create a war, then we get to restart over again, default on all the debt, and Bretton Woods too. This is the real objective. And that's what Schwab is actually pushing.
I see.
Um, you have to read between the lines. Um, Schwab has actually come out and basically said that the future is ours to construct. He is effectively a Marxist, and he thinks that government has the power and should control it. That we should not have the right to vote. We're too stupid to know what's good for us. So he's even said we'll retain some of the important things of democracy, but democracy's done. Basically, is what he's really saying. Um, then you have George Soros, who's pushed this idea of one government, and the UN has, since the very beginning, has always argued for that. They just want power. The IMF, they've created their own digital coin, and they want to replace the dollar with it. So, I mean, it's all about power struggles at this
So
point in
it's
time.
basically, is it that the the elites, whatever you want to call them, the people that have most of the power, central bankers, the Klaus Schwabs, the even the Xi Jinpings, they know the cycles are real, right? And so
Yes.
they're watching and they know that we're heading into the collapse of this entire old system, this old monetary system. And so it's not like it was their idea to collapse everything. They know that the cycles are telling them everything will collapse. And so they're going to try their best to stay in control of it and end up on the other side of that as the people that then run the entire world after the collapse. But do you is that correct in understanding? Then the second question to that is, do you think they'll succeed? Do you think that the whole idea of the Great Reset and everything that they're pointing to, do you think that that will succeed?
Uh, no, because you can't control this. All right. I think Schwab has taken that basically from our models, and I'll put it to you this way. We started our World Economic Conference in 1985. Before then, I would go off to Zurich, Toronto, different places, and we would have small institutional sessions, maybe 20, 30 people in each area. And I remember I was in Zurich, and then people were flying in from Canada to it. And it made it more interesting because you could see the capital flows in the room. And then was my client saying, why don't you just have one big one? We all get together. I said, that's a good idea. So we did that in Princeton, New Jersey in 1985. And it was very interesting. We had guys there from Saudi Arabia in the white robes, and Hasidic Jews from New York City came in. I mean, I remember my landlord said, what the heck is going on here? I said, well, on Monday, I tell the one group to buy and I tell the other one to sell. And then I switch it the next day and everybody's happy. But we became like a private United Nations in the sense that, so our events have been, quite successful but they're from people from around the world. So you get to meet a whole bunch of different people and share ideas and things of that nature. Schwab copied that and started his 2 years later, 1987.
Oh, interesting.
That's his first World Economic Forum.
So Schwab basically copied your format for your economic forum, basically, but then also used a lot of your research about cycles to then look at the future and say, okay, we have to control these cycles to put us in power. Like, let's try to use these cycles. It's like a fisherman understanding the waves, right? Understanding the tide. And that the smart fisherman will know how to use that tide and play it. But they don't want anybody else to know about the tide, right? So they're going to use it just for their advantage. And so basically, so that those globalists are thinking that they're going to take advantage of these cycles, take advantage of these collapsing systems to put themselves into power. But you're saying that they won't succeed in that. And can you elaborate a little more on that, on why the Great Reset won't succeed?
Well, I think he took that name from our forecast that We are headed toward a great reset, but not in the sense that he's going to be able to control it. That's the 2032 where everything is going to, basically collapse, and we're going to end up with new forms of government thereafter. Um, I would say that um, Marcus Vetter had done a movie on me, The Forecaster, which was funded by a German TV station. I think he filmed it in 14.
Oh,
And
I
then
watched it. Yeah, great
uh,
documentary.
then Schwab called Marcus and had him do one on him called The Forum. So I mean, it's been tit for tat, back and forth,
Schwab is
forever.
like your biggest fan.
Probably. I don't know. I mean, it's just he thinks that you can control it, and that's why I call him a Marxist. That you know, there's just these people, and Keynes was the same kind of idea. The government has the power to control it, and that's where I disagree.
Because the
I've
government can't
never
control the cycles, and that's the
exactly. I
important
mean,
part.
because the cycles are part of government. I mean, just like right now, yes, they are trying to, I think Bitcoin was probably actually created by them covertly to get people interested in digital currencies because that's where they want to go. I mean, reason is simple. I mean, if I give you $100 bill, that's it. All right. If it, if it's a digital currency, they know where I got the 100 from, and when everybody down the chain. Um, and so my view, I mean, dealing with the tax reform and all of that, I came to see their view is really that their problem is us. They wouldn't have these deficits if we all paid every dime in tax that they envision. All right. And I mean, I was in Canada, and a politician actually said that, taxation is we decide how much money you should be allowed to keep. It's that attitude. I don't know if it is something that just becomes consumes you because you're in that position, but that's why I'm against term limits. I mean, there have to be term limits there, because once these people cross that line, then their self-interest is their own and always perpetuating their power.
Yeah.
Um,
So
that's basically what I think.
so when you say that by 2032 that all the governments will change, and I know that this is much more hypothetical, but it's interesting to hear your perspective on this because you're someone that I think that has a unique ability to look into the future and get a lot of things right. So if I imagine a state where the entire world goes through a change in government, to me that's turmoil. That is a very difficult period, and I hope it lands on the other side with something that is acceptable. But what do you see that being like? And I guess, like for America, for instance, what do you see the next couple of years to be like here in America for just your average
Well,
American?
I think that um, the the final stage of the decline and fall of the United States was probably set in motion by Hillary. And what I mean by that is that she started calling anybody that voted for Trump deplorables. Um, and ever since, it's they have ended up polarizing the country. Uh, I mean, it's the first time I've ever seen it in my lifetime. Um, Somebody voted Democrat or Republican, yeah, okay, fine, big deal. I mean, now it's become almost like a hatred.
Yeah.
And when you do that, I mean, that's the same thing that Hitler and deliberately did.
Yeah.
He
Or
turned
Mao.
one group against another.
Yeah.
You take all this stuff about, transvestites. I just looked it up and I said, oh, how many? 1.6 million out of 330 million. Why? I mean, why is this even being discussed? Um, and and then you got to talk about it in school to kindergarten. I mean, I grew up with a kid who's ended up being gay. We didn't know what we were talking about when we were young. I mean, when he hit puberty, okay, that was different. But when we were young, maybe he'd want to play dolls with the girls or something. But it was never anything, dramatic that you knew. Oh, he's gay or he's this. We didn't know anything about that. I mean, it was just we were all together in the neighborhood. That was it. Um, so I think when you start identifying all these things, it's like the bankers were seen as the problem, and oh, who owned the banks? Oh, well, that was the Jews. And then it turned into crystal knock. Oh, get all the Jews. And this is the same thing they're doing with Russians. First, it starts out with Putin, then all of a sudden, this hatred of Putin turns into all Russians. Then you saw Czechoslovakia. Well, we'll confiscate the assets of anybody who's Russian. You know, it's the same. I don't know if it's a fault in human nature or what, but once you demonize a head of state, um, and you've called him a war criminal, that how can you now move to peace?
Yeah.
How can
Because they
you
don't want peace,
exactly?
right?
So um, I think that this great reset that Schwab is talking about is what our model is saying, but he thinks that he's going to be able to control it and push it in his direction. I don't see that happening,
And why
and
not?
mainly because the real failure of communism and that sort of central control of government is that it suppresses humanity. There is no imagination. There is no, evolution. There is no advancement. It's stagnation, all for the purpose of retaining power, and that is unsustainable. Um, I mean, there are plenty of examples of this type of attitude. Um, I mean, it's even in the Ten Commandments, which I find curious because here you have something written back so far. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Then you go back to the Peloponnesian War between Sparta, which was a communist state at the time. They didn't even issue coins. In Athens, which was they issued coins. They were the financial capital of the world at that time. Art, philosophy, everything that Sparta was against. So they basically went to war, and so Athens basically created a problem because they defeated the Persians and then became very arrogant as the United States is today and demanded tribute from all these other smaller states, and they will protect them against the Persians in the future. And that led to great resentment. Um, and we see that around the world today, a lot of resentment towards the United States
Oh yeah,
for
yeah.
the same reason.
Yeah, and my wife is from Australia, and though there's a lot of the United States, kind of Hollywood coming in as other countries, a lot of them actually looked down on the United States and thought that we were a bunch of gun-toting rednecks and
Um,
gangsters, and that's because I think their perception of our country is what comes out through our fake news and through our controlled Hollywood. They don't see middle America in the way that I do or that you do. And so, back to the topic of the United States and what life is like. For a lot of people watching this, they're thinking, a lot of people are planners. They're planning their retirement. They're planning their kids going to college, and so the thought of, in the next 10 years, our entire governmental system changing, as much as we all, I guess, the most, the more patriotic folks can recognize that, yeah, like it has to change. This isn't sustainable. Look at the midterms. Look at 2020. It's like, how can we place our hopes in 2024? It's like, is it really going to be a free and fair election? Probably not. So for people that are looking to the future, I mean, what do you say again? Like, so let's just say 5 years out from now, what do you see life like here in America?
well, they are pushing for World War III. Um, I think you're probably going to see that from 25 on into maybe 28 period. something like that. Um, I mean, even if no matter where you look, um, Nixon established, basically a peace with China, recognizing the one China idea. All right. Biden has basically just said, no, we don't no longer. He's gone. I would say not Biden, but whoever's writing the cue cards. um, they are intent upon creating war, and I don't think they realize what they have done. Um, you have um, pretty much the same thing as like World War II. You have countries splitting. Uh, Nixon was brilliant in the sense that he went to China to break China and Russia apart. Biden has done everything to push them together.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and Iran is basically supplying arms to Russia for Ukraine. And Ukraine was never a country before the USSR to begin with. All right. And what you have to understand is that, I the eastern part of Ukraine are all Russians, predominantly Russian. The Donbass, they're mostly Russian. I think they 80% of the region is all Russian. The right up to the river where Kiev was, that was the Russian Empire of the Czars. Okay, forget the USSR. Uh, Ukraine sided with the Nazis because Hitler promised that if they did, he would give them their own state. So that's why you have all these Ukrainian Nazis part of it. And so as soon as the 2014 revolution took place, there was an interim government put in, not elected. It was stuffed in by the United States and Europe.
It was a CIA color revolution, right?
Maybe more than that, really, not just
Okay.
the CIA, but they instantaneously launched an attack on the Donbass. They started the civil war. So it was not an elected government that did this. And if you look at Zelensky, what he promised when he ran was peace with Russia and to end the civil war. All right. And he also promised to end corruption. Ukraine is the most corrupt state, at least in Europe, if not the world. And that even came from the IMF. That's why all the Biden, corruption leads to there. Hunter was on some board in Ukraine. I mean, that's just the way it is. I wouldn't do business with the Ukrainian government before or even today. I mean, the first thing out of their mouth, well, you do this, and then we'll give you this on the side. And I'm sorry, I'm not interested in that. All right, but that's just the way it is. If you're dealing with Ukraine, you don't count your fingers. You have to make sure you still have your arm after shaking hands. It's just the way it is. It's just the culture there is very fierce, and even the mafia, the Italian mafia and the Russian mafia, they're afraid of the Ukrainian mafia and uh, Albania because Armenia, basically, because that if you understand the evolution of law, Athens basically, if you killed somebody in my family, I could, retaliation could be against anybody in your family, didn't have to be you. And it wasn't a state crime. Right? The only state crimes were against the government, like or the gods, like why they put Socrates on trial. In common law, everything disturbed the peace. So if you and I got in a fight, then we get fined because we disturbed the peace of the king. So from Athens and that whole region there, up through Macedonia, etc. The It's more of the Hatfields and McCoys, family feuds. So the the Russian mafia was always afraid of the rest of them. Why? Because Russian or Italian mafia, if you mess with them, they come and they kill you. Okay. Armenians, they come, they kill you, the wife, the kids, and the dog. It's a different attitude in that area. So Ukraine, you know, we've had two employees from Ukraine, one from Kiev and one from Donetsk. The one from Donetsk actually did all the translation for the forecaster for to be viewed in Russia. Um, the two don't even want to even talk to each other. And I'm talking this is before the war. We had a conference in Greece, and the one from Kiev would not take a connecting flight through Moscow. Had to go back to Spain, from Spain to Kiev. I mean, three times the hours. I mean, that's how the resentment and hatred is just systemic there. So I don't see this as ever going to be
peacefully resolving, right?
no. There just is not.
Well, and when you mentioned Biden pushing China into the arms of Russia and vice versa, you know, right? Which he actually, or pushing Putin into the arms of Xi. You know, that's kind of reviving a very, very old pact, you know, the Sino-Soviet pact, you know, the original planning. Do you foresee, as you're talking about what's happening, say 2024, 2025, et cetera, with World War III, um, do you think that there would ever be a chance of China and Russia together launching an attack on the United States, even kinetically on our land?
Um, I mean, it could come to that if U.S. gets that arrogant, but um, you know, Europe is taunting Russia ridiculously, and uh, and China will take Taiwan. I mean, if you're going to look at it from a strategic military, I would do both at the same time. I mean, how would the U.S. defend both areas that, you know, it's going to be impossible. Then you have North Korea shooting missiles off over Japan.
Japan. Yeah.
And then you have basically Iran, um, you know, preparing itself for war in the Middle East. I mean, that's an old bitter war between Shiite and Sunni. I mean, one believes that you know, a king is fine. The other one believes that no, it should be a religious state. I mean, these things go back centuries. You're not going to solve that. So you're going to see something in the Middle East because they'll know if they occupy the United States on two other fronts, why not? It'd be fair game for them. Um, you know, there's just you know, every president up to now has always sought world peace. Even Henry Kissinger said he's been invited to the White House by every president except for Biden. Why? Um, you know, it to me, I think that they believe they can use war as the cover story for the collapse in the monetary system.
Yeah. Like they need it. They need the war.
Yes, but I think they also think it won't go to nuclear. Um, that they can skirt around that. But we're not prepared to handle conventionally in Europe and Taiwan. I mean, Biden says we'll send boots on the ground and to defend Taiwan. Where are they going to come from? You're going to start, you know, drafting 7-year-olds? What? That's why I just don't see who the heck is in charge of this. I mean, are they, you know, maybe they're just taking too much cocaine or something. I don't know, but it's just for the life of me, you would never do this. I mean, this is, why they say Napoleon lost. He opened up, too many fronts at the same time. You just don't do this. Uh, but the monetary system is collapsing. That is clearly it. Uh, Schwab's Great Reset, I think he is probably taken from our model and just thinks that he'll be able to control it. But I don't see this as working out very well for them, or you're going to end up probably with the United States splitting into separatist areas. You might see the West Coast separate, the South separate, and the Midwest from New England. Um, Same thing in Canada. Alberta's separating from the West. This idea of centralized control and one government, one size fits all, does not work. And people should understand, um, when the Federal Reserve was created, it created all these branches. Why? Because the Panic of 1907 was seen as a regional capital flow problem. There was the San Francisco earthquake took place in 1906, but the insurance companies were on the East Coast. So all the capital started moving, banks started failing in New York. It was a shortage of cash. So they created the Fed with regional branches, and they all were independent. You can look in the old newspapers, you'll see the interest rates maybe 5% one place, 4% someplace else. They deliberately did that so to prevent that 1907 regional capital flow problem. If all the capital was leaving New York going to San Francisco, if they raised rates, then other capital would be attracted for the higher rate in New York and prevent the bank failure. That was the idea. Then, when Roosevelt wanted to install his socialistic agenda, not only did he want to try to stack the court to make it, the Supreme Court always rule in his favor, but he usurped the Federal Reserve. He brought the Fed to Washington. The head of the Fed was then to be nominated by the president. But worse, all the branches were lost independence. So the interest rate was set only in Washington. So when you have this is the problem economically. And it's it has been emerging over the last few decades. And I've been pointing this out, even in Canada. They raised interest rates to fight real estate, speculation in Toronto. Meanwhile, commodities were at their lows, and you're putting farmers and miners into bankruptcy. One size does not fit all. And that's basically, I think women learned that a long time ago with the pantyhose. But the same thing applies to government. And one single interest rate does not really conform, because there are four major different economies in the United States, from the West Coast, which is tending to be more on the technical area, the South, which has been more on the agricultural side. The North was always the industrial area, and the Midwest was more from the cattle, grain, and that's why Chicago became the center for trading there. So there are different economies, just as if they're different countries.
It's almost like an underlying principle that we see, whether it's happening at the level of the pursuit of a one world government or even across a nation, is that centralization of anything eventually collapses and returns to a system that's decentralized. And that's just, like, why is it that we don't have any successful communist country right now on earth? Because they end up collapsing. The more they centralize, it implodes. It goes against the nature, goes against the foundation of, I think, our world. And so it makes sense to me, actually, that that there's no way they can centralize the entire world, and that it's bound to collapse.
Yes, I mean this is what Schwab is an academic, and most of the academics are enamored with Marx. That's just the way it is. I had gone down to Australia and at in Melbourne to the university there, and then the guy at the time had gone to Princeton, so he invited me. Oh, gee, I wanted and so I stopped there and I just showed him a report and had some charts in it. And he dropped it as if it was like something from Satan. And he says, "You believe in that?" I said, "It's just a chart of showing what the market, you know." I said, "Everybody in New York uses this." Oh, I said, "It's just a map of where you've been and where you're going. That's it, And but it scared him, technical analysis, anything of that nature. This is what academics are about. Macquarie Bank had paid them to create some program, and they gave me a tour of this. They took a hotel and set up all these rooms, and to train people to be dealing desks, working in a bank. And it was all closed system, and he would raise interest rates, and if they didn't do what he thought they should be doing, they would flunk. I said, "This is, all theory. This is, won't you at least use the historical database of what the Fed has done and see what they do?" No, 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 no. It's why Macquarie Bank ever paid them for that. I really have no clue. But this is what you get from the academics. Uh, I was shocked. I was in London, and one of the top universities there wanted to go to lunch, and I said, "Sure, let's go." And they actually asked me if I would teach there, and I was like really taken back. I said, "No, I'm not interested in teaching." I said, "Why are you even asking me?" And they said two things. One, that no hedge fund manager apparently ever wants to go back and teach. I said, "Well, we're all into wild and crazy times, and is busy. Who wants to go to a room with 30 kids throwing chewing gum at them?" Um, but the other thing he said was that we know what we teach doesn't work. And I said, "Well, that's true. I mean, Keynesian economics, all this is just nonsense." I said, I'm my next book is going to be on trying to do this for a textbook for them. I said I would be glad to do a lecture, but not interested in teaching. Uh, but this is it, and you're right. It's that centralized idea of controlling, and when you do that, it's just look at there was a movie, Mr. Jones, when Russia took over all the farms. It was the farmer that knew when to plant, what to plant, how to rotate. And all of a sudden, those decisions are made by a bureaucrat like DMV or something. And Russia lost most of its food production. So he went to Ukraine and stole all the food there. And that's why the Ukrainians hate Russians so much. I think it was 5 to 7 million of them died of starvation. Um, and he did that just to pretend that communism was working. But you can't do this. You can't have somebody deciding what to plant who has no experience whatsoever. And we're back to that with politics again. It's they have no experience whatsoever, and it's really abysmal. And it can't be. You know, I put out these forecasts for decades. Living through them is something different. Watching, how we are collapsing in any intelligent form of government is quite interesting to say. I would never have imagined a lot of this cancel culture and stuff like that in America. I mean, I grew up where we're all supposed to be fair, equal, whatever. It just does not exist. So it's interesting, but I mean, this is how empires, nations, and city states collapse.
Yeah.
Um, if that were not true, we'd also be speaking Babylonian.
Yeah.
Everything rises and it collapses, and it's unfortunately a republic is the worst possible form of government because everybody can be bribed.
Yeah.
Even a dictatorship can't be bribed because the guy is in charge. All
Yeah.
right, what else are you going to give him? A monarch, basically the same thing. I would like to see us go to more of a direct democracy. I mean, you mentioned like the midterm elections. Honestly, my computing staff could have written a program in less than 30 days that everybody can vote online. You don't need all these paper ballots. I mean, if we can buy from Amazon in a secure fashion, why can't we vote?
Yeah.
Um,
So,
Never in my lifetime has it taken a week to
of
say who
course.
won. Um,
With all this being said, I know we're kind of nearing the end of our discussion here, but do you have hope? I mean, do you think that right now, I mean, if we look around, it's like you see all this evil, it seems, and all the agendas, and Klaus Schwab is like this Bond villain laughing and telling us we're going to own nothing. And I mean, obviously, there's a difficult period ahead amidst the collapse of these systems, but do you think that something better will emerge in the future? That something uh, is something to look forward to in all this?
yes, I think yes, we have to go through the pain in order to get to the other side. I mean, this is part of what is taking down the system, which is corrupt. Um, this system is totally unsustainable. Governments cannot continue to borrow endlessly with no intention of ever paying anything back. It's just not going to work. I mean, that undermines everybody's pensions. So it's all basically just being flushed out. That's it. We have to understand that we don't get to the greener pastures without this also.
Yeah.
We have to allow the system to collapse, understand how it's collapsing, what is taking place, so you can survive yourself rather than being sucker punched. Gee, I never saw this coming. On the other side, I mean, basically what I do is I have my own grandkids. I'm hoping that what comes after this will be this time will go towards democracy rather than um, a monarchy. I don't think we're going back to that. I don't think we're going to per se a dictator type shit. But so I think this time, and it's cyclical. We always move from one to the next. And even these booms and the markets, one time it's Japan, next time it's a commodity boom. Next time it'll be U.S. stock market. Then it'll be, oh, the euro. Everybody's go to the euro. Or Russia. That's great. We have this tendency to just want to invest in something, and it's always turns into this bubble. But it changes from instrument to instrument as it goes. All right, it's not always the same instrument. So that's just simply the way it is. I mean, that's human nature. I do think what we're looking at, I would say, is probably more likely to be more of a democratic type situation, particularly when you have Klaus Schwab out there deliberately trying to remove it. So I think that will be the knee jerk reaction in the opposite direction. Um, will the United States survive as the landmass it is today? Maybe not. Um, Again, even if you look at the formation of the United States, it was supposed to be states' rights, etc., and they're attacking that. Like Biden with abortion or whatever. Some states it violates their religious beliefs. All right, other states they don't care. You can't force your religious belief on the ones on the opposite. That causes tension. All right, I think the Supreme Court was right. Turn it back to the states. Hey, if you want an abortion, fine. Get on a bus and go to California. All right. I mean, what's the big deal? when you start going into people's faces and saying, you're wrong, you have to be doing it my way or whatever, then you get violence and confrontation. Um, it's supposed to be the United States. They convinced all the states to join together and you will retain your rights. That was the promise. And the same thing in Europe. I mean, you go to Italy, it's a different culture, different philosophy, different food than you go to Germany. Uh, it's just completely different. It's in Europe. You kiss somebody on one cheek. You go to Switzerland. No, it's got to be two cheeks because, and then the third one. Otherwise, it's bad luck. And then you go to England. It's just shaking hands. I mean, so it's different everywhere.
Yeah.
But I am optimistic for what comes afterwards. But we do have to go through the pain of tearing this down. All right. My greatest fear is that we probably end up into a serious World War III because these morons don't understand everything that they've done. And you're not going to get China and Russia surrendering their sovereignty. I also knew Bill Kristol, who wrote the book, to justify going into Iraq. And I can tell you the philosophy that was used. And they're doing it again with Russia. They act as if this guy is a dictator. He's horrible. And if we remove them, the people will cheer and give us a ticker tape parade. It has never happened once. They said the same thing about Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi. It's self-serving, and democracy, we don't even have it ourselves. So let's get real here. But they're using the same thing. Oh, if you overthrew Xi in China and Putin over there, then the people would rejoice. Not true. It's just not true.
Yeah. I think the people have to do it themselves, and it'll be hard earned and not some, giant operative. So, Martin, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. We're almost approaching 2 hours here, and I really appreciate your time. And I think the audience is going to really enjoy this conversation. Where can people follow you if people want to learn more about you, or where would you recommend folks go?
Go to our website, armstrongeconomics.com.
Okay.
We believe in privacy and rights, so you don't have to sign up or give emails or anything else, and we don't sell advertising. So you'd have to keep clicking the ads off.
That's good. Actually, I'll pull up here's your website for the folks that are looking, just armstrongeconomics.com. So yeah, Martin, again, thank you so much for being here. Do you have any final words for the folks that are watching and listening?
Just basically, understand what we're going through. It is necessary. It is basically draining the swamp, basically, really. But the people are doing this. I'm concerned about, the politics. I think, I would say the one person who was maybe absolutely correct about that was Joseph Stalin. He said, it doesn't matter how you vote. It's the person who counts that matters.
Exactly.
So I think he's very correct on that.
That's true. That's true. Well, thank you so much, Martin. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope this helps a lot of people, at least understanding the world and where we're going.
I'm sure it will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, I've got a very important question for you. Is Biden keeping you up at night? Are you tossing and turning, having nightmares about inflation, the southern invasion, diesel shortages, food shortages, Hunter Biden's laptop, and the Marxist takeover of our country? Well, have I got the solution for you. When you invest in a set of beautiful Giza cotton sheets from MyPillow, not only will you get a good night's sleep, but you'll send a clear message to all the globalists that they can't rob you of your dreams anymore. Instead of rolling around on cheap, sweaty sheets made in a Chinese slave factory for woke companies who turn their backs on the American people, you'll rest easy knowing every one of your hard-earned dollars is supporting American jobs and American patriots like Mike Lindell and Man in America. And it's not just sheets. Mike Lindell has truly mastered the art of war and comfort, arming American patriots with slippers and pillows and even a dog bed for Barky. Because, folks, even in the grips of war, who says we can't be soft and snuggly? But wait, there's more. Just watch your liberal friends and family squirm this Christmas when you give them some cozy flannel pajamas from America's most patriotic pillow salesman. And with skyrocketing energy costs, they'll have to choose between virtue signaling or freezing. MyPillow products are truly the gift that keeps on giving. Mike Lindell is sticking it to the woke companies who refuse to sell his products by cutting out the middleman and passing the savings directly to you. So head on over to mypillow.com and save up to 66% when you use the promo code MAN. Remember that word, MAN, for Man in America. Or you can also call 1-800-985-8966. That's 1-800-985-8966. Or mypillow.com with promo code MAN. So folks, go get your MyPillow products today.